It all started on a quiet Saturday morning when I was trimming the hedges in front of my house, thinking it was going to be another normal weekend in the neighborhood. But little did I know it was the day my life would take a dramatic turn. One that you absolutely don't want to miss. So make sure you stick with me until the end because you won't believe what happened when fake HOA cops tried to arrest me and then real SWAT rolled up behind them. And before we get into the chaos that unfolded right there on my driveway, take a second to hit that subscribe button to Sham Stories so you don't miss more stories just like this one. Now back to what happened that day. It began when a pair of SUVs with flashing lights pulled up to my curb. They weren't official police cruisers, but they had decals slapped on the doors that read HOA Enforcement, Authority, and the people inside wore dark uniforms with cheap metal. Badges that looked convincing from a distance. At first I thought maybe it was some kind of private security team the HOA had hired, but I had been living in this community long enough to know the HOA didn't have the budget for something like that. Still, the way they stepped out of those SUVs with sunglasses, radios on their shoulders, and batons at their belts sent a wave of unease through me. One of them, a tall, heavy-set guy with a crew cut, marched right up my driveway and barked, "Sir, you are under arrest for violation of HOA statutes." I froze mid-snip with my hedge clippers, trying to process the absurdity of what I had just heard. Under arrest for HOA violations, I almost laughed. But his stone-cold expression made it clear he wasn't joking. "Excuse me?" I said, lowering the clippers. "You can't arrest someone for HOA stuff. That's not how this works." Another figure, a woman with sharp features and a notepad, stepped forward and declared, "Failure to comply will result in forceful detainment. You've been warned about your unapproved fence modifications and unsanctioned driveway repairs." My mouth went dry. Yes, I had redone part of my driveway after it cracked during winter. And yes, I had added a taller fence for privacy. But those were normal homeowner improvements. I had ignored their nasty letters because I knew my rights. Now here they were, standing in my yard pretending to be law enforcement, and it wasn't just two of them. As I glanced past the SUVs, I realized at least 6 more uniformed figures were standing by. Trying to look intimidating, neighbors had begun peeking through blinds and stepping onto porches, whispering to each other. The tension in the air was growing thick. "You're trespassing," I told them firmly. "And if you don't leave my property, I'll call the police." The heavy-set leader smirked and replied, "We are the police here, HOA police, and you don't get to refuse." He reached for my arm like he was about to cuff me. Instinctively, I jerked back and shouted, "Touch me, and you'll regret it." At that exact moment, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was my friend Mason, an ex-American, who lived 2 blocks away. He had apparently seen the SUVs roll in and wanted to know what was happening. I quickly whispered into the phone, "These fake cops are trying to arrest me. Get over here now," and then slipped it back into my pocket before they noticed. The leader growled, "Put your hands behind your back." Neighbors started recording with their phones. The woman with the notepad shouted, "Turn those cameras off. This is official HOA business." But no one listened. In fact, more people stepped outside, filming, murmuring, and some even calling 911. That must have been the turning point because within 5 minutes, I could hear distant sirens growing louder. The fake HOA cops noticed too, and their bravado started to falter. But instead of leaving, the heavy-set guy doubled down. "Stand down, everyone. We are in control of this neighborhood," he shouted loudly enough for everyone to hear. But then it happened. The unmistakable rumble of heavy vehicles filled the street. And from around the corner, 3 massive black armored trucks rolled in with lights blazing, tactical gear officers hanging from the sides, and bold white letters stenciled across their sides that read "Police SWAT." Neighbors gasped, kids screamed in excitement, and I couldn't help but grin. The fake cops stiffened, their radios crackling with nervous chatter. The SWAT truck screeched to a halt across the street, and within seconds a dozen heavily armed real officers stormed out, rifles drawn, bulletproof vests gleaming in the sun. They spread into formation and barked through megaphones. "Everyone on the ground, drop your weapons now." My heart raced. I had never seen so much firepower in person. The fake cops panicked. Some froze, some put their hands up, and a couple actually tried to run back to the SUVs. but SWAT had them cornered. Within moments, they were face down on the asphalt, wrists zip-tied, and the heavy-set leader who had just tried to cuff me was now whining like a child. Begging not to be shot, I stood there on my lawn, still holding my hedge clippers, staring at the surreal scene unfolding before me. Neighbors cheered, some shouting, "Justice," and others yelling, "Lock them up." One SWAT officer approached me, asking if I was all right. I nodded, still stunned, and said, "They tried to arrest me for having a fence." The officer shook his head and muttered, "These HOA vigilantes are getting out of hand." I later found out they had been under investigation for months, posing as law enforcement, harassing homeowners, and even issuing fake fines that they pocketed. Their leader had a criminal record and had been pretending to run a neighborhood enforcement division without any real authority. That day, though, it ended right in front of my driveway. With the whole neighborhood watching and me realizing that standing up to their intimidation had forced their scam into the open, and this was only the beginning of a battle that would stretch far beyond that Saturday morning. As the fake HOA cops lay on the ground in zip ties, the scene turned into something that looked straight out of a crime drama. Neighbors were whispering in disbelief, some even cheering as the real SWAT officers took control. The flashing lights reflected off every window on the street, and my quiet suburban block had become the center of a full-scale police operation. But even as relief washed over me, knowing that these frauds wouldn't be dragging me away in cuffs, a gnawing feeling lingered inside my chest. This wasn't just some spur-of-a-moment scam. It was organized, deliberate, and most disturbing of all. It was happening with the blessing, or at least the silence, of certain HOA members. I could see them standing a few houses down, the so-called board president, a notorious woman named Karen with her ever-present sunglasses perched on her head, crossed arms, and a scowl that looked like she had just swallowed vinegar. She wasn't cheering like the rest of the neighbors. No, she looked furious, like this wasn't going according to her plan. When the SWAT commander barked orders for the crowd to stay back, Karen stepped forward shouting, "This is a misunderstanding. Those are authorized enforcement officers, part of our HOA protection unit." Her voice cracked with desperation, but the SWAT team wasn't buying it. One officer grabbed her arm and told her to stay behind the tape. Karen wrenched free and screamed, "You don't understand, they were doing their job." Neighbors booed her. Someone yelled, "You're the one who started this." And another shouted, "We saw you talking to them last week." I couldn't stop staring at her, realizing in that moment she wasn't just complicit. She might have been pulling the strings. And if that was true, then this wasn't over by a long shot. As the fake cops were loaded into the back of a SWAT truck, I noticed one of them, the woman with the notepad, glaring at me with pure hatred. Even as she was shoved into custody, it was a chilling look, like she wanted me to know this wasn't the last time we'd cross paths. After the initial chaos, detectives arrived to start taking statements, and my front yard turned into an impromptu interview site. They asked me to recount everything from the moment the SUVs pulled up, and I explained how the so-called HOA cops had declared me under arrest for driveway repairs and offense modification. One detective, a sharp-eyed guy named Detective Hall, kept scribbling in his notebook, occasionally nodding but rarely showing any expression. "Did they ever threaten you before today?" he asked. "Letters, phone calls, late-night knocks on the door." I admitted the HOA had sent me multiple violation notices and fines, but nothing that suggested arrest or detainment. Hall pursed his lips and muttered, "We've been tracking groups like this. They recruit disillusioned wannabe cops, give them fake uniforms and vehicles, and set them loose in communities where they can exploit authority. It looks like your HOA board president may have been their connection." My heart thudded harder at those words. The idea that Karen had essentially unleashed these people on us made my blood boil. Meanwhile, Mason, my ex-Marine friend who had sprinted over the second he heard, was now standing at my side, arms crossed, his sharp jaw set in anger. "You should have let me at M before SWAT showed up," he muttered under his breath. "Scum like that need to learn the hard way." I chuckled nervously, but deep down I shared his sentiment. If Mason hadn't called the authorities when he noticed the commotion, this could have ended very differently. "You saved me," I whispered. But he just shrugged like it was nothing. That's what neighbors do after about an hour of questioning. The SWAT team cleared out, leaving behind a stunned neighborhood. Some folks shook my hand, others patted me on the back. But the mood was clear. The HOA had finally crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. As the crowd dispersed, Karen stormed off toward her house, slamming her door so hard it echoed down the street. Mason leaned close and said, "She's not done. Trust me." Women like that doubled down when cornered. I hated how right he was. Because as night fell and I tried to settle inside my house, the adrenaline fading, I couldn't shake the paranoia. Headlights slowed near my driveway more than once. Shadows shifted near my fence. And every creak of the house made me wonder if someone was out there. Plodding around midnight, my phone buzzed with a new message. An unknown number with no name attached. The message read, "You embarrassed us today. You'll regret it." My stomach twisted. I immediately called Mason and told him. He came over within minutes, carrying his pistol and a determined look. "They're trying to scare you. But it means you hit them where it hurts," he said. We decided to call Detective Hall and forward the message to him. Hall agreed it was serious, promising to track the number. But he also gave me a grim warning. Be careful. These groups don't always operate rationally, and if your HOA is involved, that means there are still people nearby who might be feeding them information. I barely slept that night, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me. The next morning, I stepped outside to find my mailbox stuffed with papers. Violation notices stacked so thick the metal door wouldn't even close. Each one stamped with red letters, "Final warning." Karen was at it again, pretending nothing had changed. Doubling down like Mason had predicted, neighbors gathered again that morning. Most of them angry at the HOA, many demanding an emergency meeting. But Karen avoided everyone, curtains drawn tight. A security camera newly installed over her garage. I knew I couldn't fight her alone, but I also knew I couldn't back down. Because if they had succeeded in arresting me under some fake statute, what would stop them from doing it to the next neighbor, and the next? This was bigger than me. And it was time to expose every piece of corruption festering inside that HOA. And while I had no idea how ugly the fight would become, one thing was certain. The war with Karen and her fake cops was far from over. It was only just beginning. The following days felt like I was living in the middle of a siege. Every time I looked out the window, I caught sight of Karen pacing her driveway, phone pressed tightly to her ear, whispering with that same frantic energy of someone trying to hold on to power as it slipped through her fingers. Her SUV sat in the driveway with the HOA logo plastered across the side like some badge of authority. Even though it was now just a symbol of how far she had gone to blur the line between homeowners and a dictatorship, neighbors avoided her property, but they came to me, one after another, knocking on my door to tell me they were done with her games. "She's gone too far this time," said Mrs. Alvarez, clutching her grandson's hand. "Fake cops. That could have gotten someone killed." Her voice trembled with the weight of fear and anger. I nodded, promising her we'd get to the bottom of it. But inside, I knew it wouldn't be easy. Karen wasn't just a bully with a clipboard. She had connections, and clearly wasn't afraid to use them. Mason kept close to me every day, almost acting like my unofficial bodyguard. He'd walk the perimeter of my property at night, flashlight in one hand and his pistol holstered at his side. "We're not letting them sneak back in," he'd mutter as he checked every shadow. His discipline never wavered. And though I felt uneasy about needing this level of vigilance in a suburban neighborhood, I was grateful for him. Then one afternoon, Detective Hall showed up, unannounced. Pulling into my driveway with his unmarked sedan, his expression grim. "We traced that threatening text," he said as soon as I let him in. "It came from a burner phone, purchased with cash. Impossible to track directly, but what's interesting is where the purchase was made." He flipped open his notepad. "A convenience store right outside the neighborhood. A store Karen frequents almost daily." My heart clenched. "So you think it was her?" I asked, but Hall shrugged. "I think she knows more than she's admitting. But proving that in court will take time. What I can tell you is those fake cops are part of a larger ring we've been monitoring. They target HOAs because they know the boards have power, money, and residents willing to blindly follow rules." The words sank in like stones in water. This wasn't just a neighborhood issue. It was organized crime with Karen in the middle. That night, another escalation came. A flyer appeared taped to every mailbox in the community. Community alert. Neighbor arrested for unsafe property. SWAT interfered with HOA police. Residents in danger. It was signed with Karen's name and the HOA letterhead. She was rewriting history right in front of our eyes, spinning the story to make me look like a criminal and the fake cops like heroes. Neighbors brought copies of the flyer to me. Most tore them up angrily, but some whispered that they were scared, afraid Karen might actually succeed in convincing people I was the problem. Mason fumed when he saw the paper. "This is propaganda, pure and simple," he said. "She's desperate," I muttered, but the knot in my stomach grew tighter. Desperate people were dangerous. 2 days later, Karen called an emergency HOA meeting in the community center. Her flyers demanded all residents attend. I knew it was a trap, but I also knew I couldn't ignore it, so Mason and I went. Walking into that stuffy, fluorescent-lit room filled with folding chairs, I could feel dozens of eyes on me. Karen sat at the front behind a table, flanked by 2 men I didn't recognize, both in cheap suits, both with the rigid posture of hired muscle. She banged a gavel on the table and called the meeting to order. "Residents," she began, her voice shrill but confident. "Recent events have endangered our community. Unauthorized outsiders, SWAT officers interfered with HOA enforcement, putting you all at risk." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. But Karen pressed on. Our HOA officers acted within their rights to maintain order. And certain neighbors, her eyes locked on me like daggers, have created chaos and invited government intrusion into our peaceful neighborhood. Mason leaned over to me, whispering, "She's painting herself as the victim." I clenched my fists, waiting until she paused before standing. "Those weren't officers. They were criminals," I said loud enough for everyone to hear. "And you," I pointed at her, "invited them here. You're the reason we had fake cops threatening to arrest people over fence repairs. SWAT showed up because they knew those imposters were dangerous. You put this neighborhood in danger, not me." The room erupted in shouts, some in my defense, others muttering uncertainty. Karen slammed the gavel again, out of order. "Sit down," she barked. But I refused. "No, people deserve the truth," I said. Then I pulled out my phone and held it up. Detective Hall gave me confirmation. "Those criminals are part of a national ring, and Karen's ties to them are being investigated." Her face paled, and for the first time, cracks formed in her mask of confidence. The crowd murmured louder now. A few residents even stood up and demanded she explain herself. Her hired muscles shifted uneasily. Karen stammered, "This is slander, lies. This man is dangerous." But the panic in her voice betrayed her. Mason put a hand on my shoulder, guiding me back to my seat as the meeting devolved into chaos, neighbors arguing, Karen shouting, and eventually storming out when she realized control had slipped through her fingers. But even as she fled, she turned back and hissed. This isn't over. The following morning, I discovered just how serious her threat was. My car tires had been slashed, deep cuts through the rubber that left the vehicle unusable. Mason inspected the damage, shaking his head. This was deliberate, clean cuts. She's escalating again. I called Detective Hall immediately. He came out to photograph the tires and file a report, but even he admitted catching her in the act would be tough without cameras. That afternoon, I installed motion detectors and floodlights all around my property. Mason helped me set up additional cameras. "Turning my home into a fortress, she's going to slip up," he said. "But until then, we stay vigilant." That night, the neighborhood was oddly quiet. No cars slowed in front of my house. No shadows lurked near my fence. But the silence felt like the calm before a storm. I sat on the porch with Mason, both of us sipping coffee, both scanning the darkness, when my phone buzzed again with a new message, this time a picture. It showed my house circled in red marker with the words, "Next time you won't be sulfur monoxide," Lucky scrawled across the image. My blood turned cold. Whoever was behind this had been close enough to photograph my home. Mason clenched his jaw. "She's not just bluffing anymore. She's targeting you." I sent the photo to Hall immediately, who promised to escalate the case. but warned me again to stay on guard. The reality was unavoidable now. Karen wasn't just a nuisance, she was dangerous. And she had powerful allies still lurking in the shadows. If I wanted to protect myself and my neighborhood, I couldn't just wait for her to make another move. I had to be ready to strike back, and soon. The days after the threatening photo felt heavier than anything before. Like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for Karen to explode again. Neighbors who once avoided me now stopped by in nervous clusters, asking what they should do. Some wanted to start a petition to remove Karen from the HOA board. Others suggested calling a lawyer to dissolve the HOA entirely. But every single one of them had the same look in their eyes: fear, because Karen wasn't just handing out fines anymore. She was weaponizing intimidation, and the reminder of that was still taped to my fridge. The photo of my own home with a red circle drawn around it like I was some target. Mason pushed for more direct action. We can't wait for her to calm down. She's escalating. We need to go on offense, he said. His voice like steel as he paced my kitchen. The longer we sit back, the more time she has to rally her cronies. I knew he was right. But I also knew that moving against her without a plan could backfire. Detective Hall's building a case, I reminded him, if we push too fast. She twisted around again. Mason scoffed. She already twisted everything. You saw that meeting? She's poisoning the community. Still, I agreed to a middle ground. I would start documenting every interaction with Karen, every violation notice, every strange car parked outside. I installed more cameras, put up a recorder app on my phone, and even bought a body camera to wear during confrontations, if she wanted to play dirty. I'd play meticulous. The breaking point came sooner than expected a week later. I woke up to find bright orange spray paint scrawled across my garage door in massive letters. Criminal. The paint dripped down in ugly streaks. Neighbors gathered quickly, gasping at the sight. Some whispered angrily that Karen had gone too far. Others just shook their heads in despair. Mason immediately started checking my cameras, and sure enough, we caught her. Karen herself, at 2 a.m, striding across my driveway with a spray can in hand. Her face twisted in concentration as she painted the word, then stepping back to admire it before walking off. When we replayed the footage for Detective Hall, he didn't even try to hide his satisfaction. This is exactly what we needed. He said vandalism, intimidation, caught on camera. We can move this forward fast. But he also warned us. She's going to realize she's been caught. And when she does, lash out harder. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. It was about exposing her to everyone. So with Hall's blessing, Mason and I put the footage on a USB drive and arranged a private meeting with the concerned neighbors. We gathered in Mrs. Alvarez's garage, 20 people crowded together on folding chairs and crates. Everyone tense, whispering, until Mason plugged in the drive and hit play. The screen showed Karen in the act, bold as ever, painting lies across my garage door. The room erupted in outrage. I knew it. One man shouted, "She's a criminal herself," cried another. Even Mrs. Alvarez, normally the calmest among us, shook her fist. She's been terrorizing us for years. It ends now, by the end of that night. The neighbors had formed a coalition demanding Karen's immediate resignation. We drafted a letter, signed by everyone present, and delivered it to her mailbox the next morning. But of course Karen didn't resign. Instead, she went on the offensive again, that afternoon. Marched into my yard with 2 men in tow. Not the fake cops this time, but what looked like private security. Tall, broad-shouldered guys with buzz cuts and mirrored sunglasses. She pointed at me with a trembling finger. "You think you can slander me with fake videos?" she screamed. "I'll sue you. I'll sue everyone. You're destroying this community." Mason stepped between us, his presence like a brick wall. "Back off, Karen," he growled. "Right." But the men behind her smirked, clearly waiting for orders. I lifted my phone, body camera blinking. "You're on record," I said, my voice steady, despite the fear knotting in my gut. "Everything you say, everything you do, is being documented." Karen faltered for a moment, her eyes darting to the camera. Then she spat at the ground and stormed off, her bodyguards following reluctantly. But the damage was done. She had exposed herself again. More witnesses had seen her rage, and my footage was only growing. Later that night, Detective Hall called me. his voice urgent. "We've secured warrants. We're going to raid Karen's house in the morning. I need you and your neighbors to stay back." "Let us handle this." My pulse quickened. "You think she's hiding something?" Hall's sigh crackled through the phone. I'd bet my badge on it. Sure enough, the next morning at sunrise, unmarked cars rolled into the neighborhood. Plainclothes officers swarmed Karen's property, pounding on the door. Neighbors peeked through curtains as agents carried out boxes of files, computer equipment, even bags of what looked like counterfeit badges and uniforms. Mason and I stood at the edge of my driveway, watching in stunned silence. She really was working with them, I muttered. The fake cops, the threats, all of it. Karen herself was dragged out in cuffs, screaming that she was innocent, that she was being framed, her face red with fury. But no one believed her anymore. Not after the flyers, the vandalism, the footage, the threats. It was over, or so I thought. But later that day, as the sun dipped low and I finally felt like I could breathe, a black SUV rolled slowly past my house. Tinted windows hiding whoever was inside, it paused for just a second too long before pulling away. Mason noticed it too. "That wasn't random," he said, his hand instinctively resting on his pistol. And just like that, I knew this battle wasn't finished. Karen might have been in cuffs, but the people she worked with, the larger group behind the fake HOA cops, they were still out there. And now they knew exactly who had helped bring her down. The war had shifted from Karen's tyranny to something even darker. Something that would test me in this neighborhood in ways we couldn't yet imagine. The black SUV haunted my thoughts for days. The way it had lingered outside my home felt like a message. A warning that Karen's downfall hadn't erased the network she was tangled with. Instead, it had stirred them up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was now firmly on their radar. Neighbors whispered about it too. Some swore they saw the same SUV circling the block at night. Others admitted they heard footsteps near their fences or caught glimpses of shadows slipping between houses. The tension that had started with Karen's antics had now evolved into something sharper. A fear of outsiders, of unseen hands pulling strings. Mason became my shadow during that time, sleeping on my couch most nights. His pistol never more than an arm's reach away. "You can't let your guard down," he warned me. "The second you do, that's when they'll strike." And I believed him because Karen had been bold. But whoever she'd been tied to was more careful, more calculating. Their silence was louder than Karen's screaming ever had been. Detective Hall kept in contact, updating me on Karen's case. "She's facing charges for harassment, vandalism, and fraud," he explained. "But when we raided her house, we found encrypted drives. We're still working on those. Could be weeks before we know what's on them." Mason wasn't satisfied with waiting. He spent hours each day combing through our camera feeds, cross-referencing license plates with his own databases. "These people aren't amateurs," he muttered one evening. "They're trained, or at least organized. And if they think you're the reason Karen went down, they'll come for you eventually." His words were meant as preparation. But they dug into me like splinters. Every creak in my house became a threat. Every unfamiliar face on the street felt like a scout. Then, one night, just as I was starting to drift off, a loud bang shook the side of my house. I bolted upright. Mason already sprinting to the window. "Molotov," he shouted, yanking me toward the door. Flames licked up the siding of my garage. Glass shards glittered on the ground. Neighbors rushed out with hoses, spraying frantically as Mason and I beat at the fire with blankets. By the time the fire department arrived, we had it under control. But the scorch marks were a violent reminder that the SUV hadn't been a bluff. This was escalation when the police questioned me. I handed them the camera footage again. And sure enough, the SUV appeared, 2 masked figures stepping out. One lighting the bottle before hurling it at my house, then both running back to the vehicle. "They're sending a message," Hall said grimly when he saw it. "They want you scared. They want you to back down." But fear wasn't what I felt anymore. It was rage. I had endured Karen's harassment, survived the humiliation, and exposed her for what she was. I wasn't about to let her allies burn me into silence, so Mason and I made a choice. We weren't just going to wait for the cops to crack Karen's drives. We were going to dig ourselves, Mason called in favors from old military buddies, guys who specialized in surveillance and cybersecurity. Within days, we had a small war room set up in my basement. Laptops humming, maps pinned to corkboards, photos and license plates connected by red string. "This isn't just about Karen," Mason explained to the group. "She was a pawn, maybe a loud pawn, but still just a piece on the board. These guys are bigger. And they're running something under the cover of this HOA." It sounded insane when he said it out loud. But the evidence piled up quickly. Shell companies tied to Karen's name. Money funneled through HOA fees into offshore accounts. Connections to fake contractors who billed for work never done. What had seemed like a petty neighborhood power grab was actually a well-oiled machine, bleeding money from homeowners under the guise of HOA projects. The fake cops weren't just for intimidation, they were enforcers, keeping residents too scared to question the endless fees. Realizing the scale of it made my skin crawl. But it also gave us leverage, because if we could prove it, if we could link Karen's network to something bigger, the authorities would have no choice but to bring it all down. Our break came when one of Mason's friends, a wiry guy named Tate with a knack for hacking, managed to break into an old laptop pulled from Karen's garage. "Got something?" he muttered one night, his screen filled with spreadsheets, emails, and photos. "These aren't just accounts. This is a whole hierarchy. And look at this meeting schedules, drop-off locations. Even names." Mason leaned over his shoulder, eyes narrowing. "These aren't just local idiots. These are connected to bigger organizations, maybe even cartel money laundering." The revelation hit me like a punch. No wonder Karen had felt untouchable. She wasn't just a tyrant drunk on HOA power. She had protection. And now that protection was staring at us through tinted SUV windows and throwing firebombs at my home. The question became not if they'd strike again, but when. And the answer came sooner than we thought, 2 nights later. While Mason and I were reviewing footage, motion alerts popped up from my backyard cameras. 4 figures dressed in black were creeping along my fence. Their movements coordinated. Professional Mason's jaw tightened. "They're coming in," he whispered. Reaching for his rifle, we killed the lights, crouched low. Listening to the sound of the latch on my gate clicking open, the intruders moved silently, but my cameras caught everything. Their faces hidden under balaclavas, their hands gloved. One carried a crowbar, another a duffel bag that looked heavy. My heart pounded. I wanted to call 911, but Mason shook his head, mouthing too slow. Instead, he slid to the back door, weapon raised. His body a coiled spring ready to strike. The intruders crept closer, one shining a small flashlight along the windows, another testing the back door handle. That's when Mason stepped forward, yanked the door open, and shouted, "Freeze!" His voice thundered in the night. The intruders stumbled back, one dropping the duffel bag with a heavy metallic clank. But instead of running, they turned aggressive. Crowbar guy lunged forward, swinging. Mason fired a warning shot into the ground. The blast echoing like thunder, neighbors screamed awake. Porch lights flicked on across the block. The intruders scrambled, scooping up their bag and vaulting the fence with terrifying speed. By the time the cops arrived, they were gone. But the bag they'd dropped remained. And inside we found enough to change everything: bolt cutters, duct tape, zip ties, and a printed photo of me with my address scrawled underneath. It wasn't intimidation anymore. It was preparation for kidnapping. The realization chilled me to my bones, but it also galvanized the neighborhood. When we showed the bag's contents at an emergency gathering the next day, the fear that had once paralyzed everyone turned into fury. People were done being quiet. They were ready to fight back. "This isn't just about him," Mrs. Alvarez said, her voice shaking but firm. "This is about all of us. They've been bleeding us dry for years. Now they want to terrorize us into silence. We can't let it happen." The room erupted in agreement. And for the first time, I saw the neighborhood not as victims, but as allies. The walls Karen had built with fear were crumbling, replaced by something stronger: unity. What none of us realized was that this unity was about to be tested in the most violent way imaginable. Because the people behind Karen weren't about to let their operation collapse without a fight, and their next move would make everything that came before look like child's play. The discovery of that bag with zip ties, duct tape, and a photo of me marked everything as a turning point. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was an escalation into outright violence and abduction. And the moment we presented it to the neighborhood, the shift was palpable. People who had once kept their heads down to avoid Karen's wrath or the fake cops' intimidation now realized silence was no longer protection. It was a death sentence. Neighbors who had barely spoken to one another began meeting daily. Porches turned into war rooms. Garages into supply stations. Mason spearheaded much of it, drawing up patrol schedules, training residents on what to do if the SUV showed up again, even loaning out spare radios so communication wouldn't rely on cell phones that could be jammed or traced. And for the first time since Karen's grip had taken hold, I felt a strange swell of hope. But it was mixed with the gnawing dread that whoever was behind this wouldn't simply back down because we were finally standing tall. They would double down, and sure enough, within a week, that's exactly what happened. It started with power outages. First, my house went dark, then the entire block, plunging the neighborhood into pitch black. The timing was too deliberate to be coincidence. Mason had warned us this was how organized groups tested defenses, cutting power to see how quickly panic set in. But instead of caving, we lit lanterns. Neighbors with generators shared them. And the watch patrols doubled. The SUV showed up again that night, creeping down the street, headlights off. But this time, we didn't cower. We lined the sidewalks, flashlights in hand, radios buzzing, and when the SUV slowed near my driveway, Mason strode right into the middle of the street. His rifle slung across his chest. He didn't even raise it, just stood there staring them down after a tense moment. The SUV rolled forward and vanished into the night. A small victory, but one that made everyone feel stronger. Then came the second strike, this one far bolder. 2 days later, in broad daylight, men dressed in the fake police uniforms came storming into the cul-de-sac. They didn't knock, didn't hesitate. They marched toward my house with papers in hand. Shouting they had a warrant, neighbors came pouring out. Cameras rolling, phones raised, documenting everything. You're not real cops. Someone shouted, "We know who you are." The men ignored the protests, pounding on my door, demanding I come out. Mason flanked me as I stepped outside, my hands trembling, but my voice loud. "If you take one more step, you'll regret it. The real police are already on their way," I lied. But my neighbors backed me up, chanting, filming, turning the pressure back on them. For a moment, I thought they might force their way in anyway. But then, just as the tension hit its peak, the roar of engines filled the air. Black armored vehicles barreled into the street. Lights flashing, doors bursting open, and out poured the real SWAT team, weapons drawn. Their precision and presence like a tidal wave, the fake cops froze. Their bravado shattering as heavily armed officers screamed commands. "Get down. Drop your weapons. Hands on the ground?" It was chaos. Neighbors screamed, kids cried. But the SWAT team was efficient, slamming the imposters to the pavement, zip-tying their wrists and dragging them away. Mason had called in a favor, I found out later, using his old military contacts to fast-track an official response, because he'd known this was coming, and he hadn't trusted the local police alone to handle it. When the dust settled, the imposters were hauled away, their SUV confiscated, and the neighborhood left staring at each other in stunned silence. The relief was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the reality that this was just the surface. The men arrested were pawns, soldiers carrying out orders, and the SWAT officers made it clear, in no uncertain terms, this isn't over. We've seen operations like this before. And if your HOA is connected, you're sitting on a powder keg. Detective Hall confirmed it later that evening, calling me directly, his voice tight. The men we arrested are linked to a shell corporation tied to Karen's accounts. You weren't just imagining it. There's something massive running under this HOA. Money laundering, racketeering, maybe worse. The weight of it nearly crushed me. The absurdity that what had started as Karen's petty vendetta over HOA power had now unraveled into a criminal syndicate with deep pockets and dangerous muscle, and I was caught squarely in the crosshairs. Mason refused to let me leave my house alone. Escorts became mandatory, and the neighborhood, galvanized by the sight of SWAT storming in, became even more united. We weren't just residents anymore. We were a community under siege, and our survival depended on solidarity. But the criminals weren't finished. The very next night, shots rang out, glass shattered across my living room. Bullets whistling past as I dove behind the couch, Mason yanked me to the floor, returning fire through the window as neighbors scrambled for cover. The sound of screeching tires filled the air as the attackers sped off, leaving behind shell casings and the acrid stench of gunpowder. The police combed the scene, but it was clear. The message was escalation. If intimidation failed, if abduction failed, then elimination was the next step. I should have been terrified, but instead something hardened inside me. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice, about ripping the mask off these predators and making sure they never terrorized another neighborhood again. Mason echoed the sentiment. They drew the line tonight. Now we draw ours, and so we doubled down. The basement war room became a hive of activity. Tate worked day and night, breaking into more files, uncovering deeper links between the HOA and offshore accounts. Names of contractors tied to organized crime, even connections to politicians who had conveniently ignored resident complaints for years. Every thread we pulled revealed another layer of corruption. And though it felt overwhelming, it also fueled us. Because the more we uncovered, the clearer it became that we had the power to end this if we were brave enough to keep going. The neighborhood rallied too, patrolling in shifts, building barricades, even setting up their own surveillance to cover blind spots. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to fight back. I knew it couldn't last forever, though, because sooner or later, the men behind Karen would realize brute force wasn't working, and they'd adapt. And when they did, it would either be the moment we broke, or the moment we stood stronger than ever, as Mason put it one night. Staring at the maps covered in red string, we're in the middle of a war, whether we asked for it or not. And wars don't end with half measures. They end when one side can't get up again. The question is, which side will that be? And as much as the thought chilled me, I knew he was right. Because Karen had opened a door that could never be closed. And now the only way out was through, with every night that passed. With every attack we repelled, the storm drew closer. And I couldn't help but wonder, when the final strike came, would we be ready? Or would the syndicate swallow us whole? The gunfire that ripped through my living room had left more than shattered glass behind. It carved a permanent scar across the neighborhood, reminding us all that this wasn't just an HOA feud anymore. It was war. And the question Mason had asked who would be left standing goad in my head every time. I lay awake at night listening for the growl of engines outside. The community was tense. Kids no longer played in the yards. Neighbors walked in pairs with radios clipped to their belts. And even the family dogs had taken on roles as alarms, barking wildly at the faintest disturbance. It was exhausting living like prey. But at the same time, it bound us tighter than ever. A cul-de-sac turned into a fortress. And I was no longer just a homeowner, but the unwilling figurehead of a resistance movement. What none of us expected was that Karen herself, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, would try to make one last desperate play. She had gone quiet for weeks after the SWAT raid and the arrests, but silence didn't mean surrender. When her car was spotted late one night sneaking into the back entrance of the community clubhouse, we knew she was up to something. Mason and I led a small group to investigate, creeping through the shadows until we saw the glow of lights inside. Through the windows, we caught a glimpse of Karen pacing with a phone pressed to her ear, papers spread out across the table. And next to her, 3 men we recognized immediately as the ones who had tried to storm my house earlier. Out on bail, back in her orbit, the sight made my stomach churn. They weren't done, not by a long shot. Tate worked his magic that night, hacking into the clubhouse Wi-Fi and patching into her call. What we heard chilled us. Karen wasn't just ranting about neighborhood disputes, she was negotiating, promising the syndicate she could deliver full control of the improvement community if they'd just give her the muscle to take out the resistance once and for all. The house will be mine, the pool, the land. All of it, she hissed. They'll regret ever crossing me, the arrogance. The delusion it would have been laughable if the danger wasn't so real. Mason's jaw tightened as he listened, his knuckles white around the edge of the table. "She's not going to stop until we put her in a cage," he muttered. And he was right. We couldn't just wait for the next attack. We had to be the ones to strike. So the plan was set. Not for violence, but for exposure. The next HOA meeting was already scheduled. Karen's last attempt at legitimacy, and we decided to make it her downfall. Cameras were hidden, files were copied, evidence stacked in a binder thicker than a phone book. Tate even set up a live stream so there could be no denying or burying the truth. When the night came, the clubhouse was packed. Neighbors crammed shoulder to shoulder, whispers buzzing like static. Karen sat at the front, smug as ever, flanked by her cronies. She launched into her speech about order and progress, spinning tales about how the community was failing because of me, because of Mason, because we resisted her leadership. But before she could finish, Mason rose, his voice booming. "You want order, Karen? Let's show them the kind of order you've been running." The projector lit up behind him. Spilling images across the wall, bank transfers to shell accounts. Photos of the imposter cops with Karen at backyard parties, recordings of her promising property to criminals. The room erupted in gasps, shouts. People surged to their feet demanding answers. Karen's face drained of color. She tried to shout over them. Tried to blame me, Mason, anyone but herself. But the evidence was undeniable. Then, as if fate had scripted it, the doors burst open. Real police storming in with warrants in hand. Detective Hall at the lead. His voice calm but firm. "Karen Miller, you were under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, fraud, and attempted kidnapping." The room froze as officers swarmed her, cuffing her hands while she shrieked about her rights, about how it was all a mistake. But no one believed her anymore. Her cronies tried to bolt, but they were taken down just as fast. And in that moment, the neighborhood erupted, not in fear this time, but in applause. Cheers ringing out as the woman who had terrorized us for so long was finally dragged out into the night. It felt surreal, like watching a storm cloud finally burst and vanish. The relief was overwhelming. Neighbors hugged, some even cried, the weight lifting all at once. But it wasn't just Karen's fall we celebrated. It was the proof that we were stronger than her, stronger than the lies, stronger than the fear she had wielded like a weapon. In the weeks that followed, the cleanup began. Both literal and emotional. Fences were repaired, windows replaced. Families began to breathe again. Laughter returned to the yards. And slowly but surely, life crept back to normal. But it wasn't the same normal as before. It was better, tighter, the kind of bond forged only in fire. Mason and I remained close, his presence a reminder that sometimes heroes didn't wear uniforms anymore. Sometimes they were just neighbors who refused to back down. As for me, I looked at my house with new eyes, no longer just for walls and a roof, but a symbol of defiance, of standing your ground when everything tells you to run. The police investigation widened, more arrests were made, and the syndicate's grip on our town was shattered. Though I knew shadows still lingered out there somewhere, waiting for another chance. I didn't fear them anymore because I wasn't alone, and because I had learned the power of community, of truth, of refusing to bow. Still, late at night when I walked past the pool or glanced at the tree line, I could almost hear Karen's shrill voice echoing, threatening, promising revenge. And I wondered if she was sitting in her cell right then, plotting her next move. Maybe she was. Maybe she wasn't. But it didn't matter, because this time we'd be ready. This time, we'd see it coming. And as I stood on my porch watching the sun dip behind the horizon, I realized something else to our story wasn't just ours anymore. It was a warning. A reminder to anyone who ever thought power and fear could replace respect and decency. And if you're hearing this now, remember, it could happen to you. The only question is, would you fight back? Or would you let the Karens of the world win? Don't let them stand up, push back, because in the end, justice only comes to those who demand it. And if you want more stories of justice, revenge, and communities rising against the impossible, make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories and never miss the next battle.